August 1944. German generals studied their intelligence reports and smiled. American tanks were running out of fuel just 400 miles from Normandy, exactly as predicted. "They can build machines," one Wehrmacht officer noted with satisfaction, "but they cannot sustain an army across France." Then, on August 25th, something appeared on French roads that would shatter every assumption the German general staff had ever made about warfare. 6,000 American trucks operating 24 hours a day in an endless convoy, driven primarily by black soldiers the Nazis had been taught to dismiss as inferior. Within weeks, this Red Ball Express was delivering more supplies than Germany's entire railway system, and German POWs watching this impossible river of vehicles would be forced to confront a terrifying question. What if everything we were taught about American weakness was a lie designed to hide a form of power we never understood?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. August 1944. Inside a concrete bunker near the German border, 3 officers stood around a large table covered with maps. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and damp stone. General Gunther von Kluge leaned forward, his finger tracing a line across France. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance like a summer storm that never ended. The Americans had landed in Normandy 2 months earlier. Everyone knew this. The beaches were theirs now. Paris would fall soon. But here, in this room, the German officers were not panicking. They were calculating. One officer, a logistics expert named Oberst Friedrich Weber, tapped a red circle on the map where American tanks had stopped moving. Weber had studied supply chains his entire career. He understood numbers the way a musician understands notes. The Americans were running out of fuel. Their Third Army, led by the aggressive General Patton, had chased German forces across hundreds of miles. Now those American tanks sat silent in French fields, their engines cold, waiting for gasoline that was still sitting on beaches 400 miles away. Weber did the mathematics in his head. 28 American divisions. Each division needed thousands of gallons of fuel every single day. The ports were destroyed, the railways were bombed, the bridges were blown. How would the Americans move 800,000 gallons of fuel daily across a devastated country? Von Kluge lit another cigarette. He had fought in Russia. He had seen the Eastern Front swallow entire armies. He understood that wars were not won by brave soldiers alone. Wars were won by bread and bullets arriving on time. He looked at his officers and said something they all believed. Americans can build wonderful tanks and planes, but they cannot feed an army this far from the ocean. They do not understand logistics the way we do. We have studied this for 200 years. The room felt almost comfortable then. These men had trained at the finest military academies in Europe. They had read Clausewitz and studied Napoleon's mistakes. They knew that armies advancing too fast always outrun their supplies. It was a law of war as reliable as gravity. The Americans were about to learn this law the hard way. In the city of Chartres, just 60 miles from Paris, American supply officers were having very different conversations. Mountains of supplies sat stacked on Normandy beaches. Crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, boxes of food. All of it desperately needed by soldiers pushing east. But the distance was too great. Traditional supply methods were failing. Trucks would drive supplies forward, then drive back empty for more. It took too long. Patton's tanks were stuck. Montgomery's British forces were waiting. The great Allied advance was grinding to a halt exactly as the German generals predicted. But something was being planned, something the Germans had not seen before and could not imagine. In supply depots across Normandy, soldiers were gathering trucks. Not a few dozen trucks, not even a few hundred. 6,000 identical trucks, all the same model, all painted the same olive green. GMC 2.5-ton trucks called Jimmies by the men who drove them. Every truck is built in the same factory. Every part is interchangeable. Every driver trained the same way. Most of these drivers were black soldiers. In 1944, the American Army was segregated. Black soldiers were often given support roles rather than combat positions. But now those soldiers would become the backbone of an operation that would change the war. They gathered in company formations, checking their vehicles, studying maps of French roads. They did not know it yet, but they were about to run the largest truck convoy in military history. On August 25th, the convoy began. French civilians in small villages heard them first. A rumble that did not stop. Then they saw them, trucks, endless trucks, one after another, moving in a steady line that stretched beyond sight. The trucks drove on roads marked with red balls, giving the operation its name, the Red Ball Express. The trucks moved day and night. When one driver grew too tired, another took his place. The convoy never stopped. German reconnaissance planes spotted them within days. Pilots radioed back to headquarters with confused reports. They described a river of vehicles flowing across France. Intelligence officers calculated the numbers and recalculated them, certain there was a mistake. 6,000 trucks operating simultaneously. Convoys spaced exactly 60 yards apart, traveling at 60 miles per hour. One-way loop roads, so trucks never slowed down passing each other. Mathematics was impossible. This many trucks would consume enormous amounts of fuel just to operate. How could the Americans afford to waste resources on road transport when railways were so much more efficient? Weber received these reports in his bunker. He read them twice. He checked the numbers himself. 12,500 tons of supplies moving daily by truck alone. It violated everything he had learned. Trucks were for short distances. Railways were for long distances. This was basic knowledge. Every military in Europe understood this. The German army used trucks, of course, but they were a mix of different models. Civilian vehicles requisitioned from towns, maintained by mechanics who had to learn each truck's unique problems. And they still relied heavily on horses. Hundreds of thousands of horses, pulling wagons the way armies had moved supplies for centuries. But the Americans were doing something different. They were simply overwhelming the problem with numbers. They had so many trucks that if some broke down, it didn't matter. They had so many spare parts that repairs took hours instead of days. They had so many drivers that the convoy never rested. Weber stared at the intelligence reports and felt something unfamiliar. Not quite fearful, not quite respectful, something closer to confusion. The Americans were breaking the rules of logistics, and somehow it was working.
By early September, the Red Ball Express had become something more than a supply line. It had become a living machine that never slept. French farmers working in fields would pause their work to watch the trucks roll past. Children counted them until they lost track of the numbers. The convoys moved through rain and sunshine, through day and night, an endless stream of identical green vehicles carrying the weight of war on their wheels. Oberst Weber did not see the Red Ball Express from a French farmhouse. He saw it from the back of a truck carrying German prisoners. His capture had happened quickly during a confused retreat near the Belgian border. One moment he was coordinating a withdrawal, the next American infantry surrounded his position. Now he sat with 40 other German officers, hands bound loosely, riding in an American truck toward a processing center. The truck smelled of canvas and diesel fuel. Through the open back, Weber watched the road behind them. That was when he saw it. Another truck approached from behind, then another, then another. The trucks came in a steady rhythm, each one precisely spaced from the next. Weber began counting.
He reached 100 trucks and stopped counting. They just kept coming. The German officer next to him, a captain who had commanded a tank company, leaned forward to look. The captain whispered that he had never seen so many vehicles in one place. Weber said nothing. He was calculating in his head. If each truck carried 5 tons and there were thousands of trucks moving constantly, never stopping, the daily tonnage would exceed what the German army moved in a week. The truck carrying the prisoners pulled to the side to let faster traffic pass. An American military policeman waved them over, his white helmet bright in the afternoon sun. The prisoners sat in silence as the red ball convoy thundered past. Weber noticed something that made him lean closer to the truck's opening. The drivers were black. Not some of them, most of them. Company after company of black soldiers behind the wheels, their faces focused, their hands steady on the steering wheels. Weber had been taught that armies led by such men would lack discipline and organization, yet here they were, operating the most organized supply system he had ever witnessed. A truck in the convoy ahead suddenly sputtered and pulled to the roadside. Weber watched to see what would happen. Would the convoy stop? Would it cause a traffic jam? Within 3 minutes, a repair vehicle arrived. 2 mechanics jumped out with toolboxes. They opened the hood while other trucks continued flowing past without slowing. 15 minutes later, the broken truck rejoined the convoy. Weber looked at the German captain beside him. The captain's face showed the same confusion Weber felt. Their own supply trucks, when they broke down, might wait days for parts. Sometimes they were simply abandoned. The prisoner truck reached a supply depot near Verdun as the sun began to set. American soldiers directed them into a holding area surrounded by wire fencing. But Weber could see beyond the fence into the depot itself. What he saw made him forget about being a prisoner. The depot stretched across acres of French countryside. Stacks of wooden crates rose higher than houses. Fuel barrels were lined up in rows that seemed to have no end. Soldiers operated forklifts, moving pallets with mechanical precision. Floodlights were being positioned on tall poles, preparing for night operations. A young American lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, was assigned to organize the prisoners into groups. He spoke some German and explained the rules while smoking a cigarette. The lieutenant mentioned casually that this depot supplied General Montgomery's British forces pushing into Belgium. Montgomery had requested 1,000 tons of supplies daily. The Americans were delivering 1,400 tons. The lieutenant said this like it was a normal thing, like delivering 400 extra tons of supplies across hundreds of miles of damaged roads was simple mathematics. Weber asked the lieutenant, in careful English, how this was possible. The lieutenant seemed surprised by the question. He shrugged and said they just loaded the trucks and drove them. If they needed more trucks, they got more trucks. If they needed more fuel for the trucks, they shipped more fuel. The solution to every problem seemed to be simply having more of everything. Weber had spent his career learning how to do more with less. The Americans were doing more with more, and it was devastatingly effective. That night, Weber lay on a cot in a temporary prisoner barracks. Through the thin walls, he could hear the depot operating. Engines running, men shouting orders, forklifts beeping as they reversed. The sound never stopped. He thought about the German supply system, which operated during daylight hours when possible to avoid Allied aircraft. The Americans worked around the clock, using electric lights powered by portable generators. They had generators to spare. They had lights to spare. They had everything to spare. A week later, Weber was transferred again, this time to a larger processing center. During the journey, the truck passed through a small French town that had been liberated recently. American soldiers were gathered in the town square taking a break. Weber saw something that seemed impossible. A truck had arrived with cases of Coca-Cola. Not ammunition, not fuel, soft drinks. The soldiers were drinking them in the afternoon heat, the glass bottles sweating with condensation. Weber had not tasted a soft drink since before the war began. German soldiers at the front received ersatz coffee made from acorns and bread that was half sawdust. These American soldiers were drinking Coca-Cola delivered to them hundreds of miles from the nearest factory.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The German captain sitting next to Weber saw it too. The captain made a bitter joke about American priorities. But Weber did not laugh. He was beginning to understand something that frightened him more than defeat. The Americans were not just winning because they had more supplies. They were winning because they existed in a different reality of abundance. They could afford to ship soft drinks to the front because shipping soft drinks did not prevent them from also shipping ammunition, fuel, food, and spare parts. They had enough capacity to do everything simultaneously. Waste was not a problem for them. Waste was a strategy. They simply built so much that losing half of it still meant victory. September 17th arrived with news that spread through the prisoner camp like electricity. Operation Market Garden had begun. Montgomery was launching a massive airborne assault into Holland, attempting to capture bridges and create a corridor straight into Germany. The prisoners gathered in small groups discussing what this meant. Some felt hope that the operation would fail. Others knew that even if it failed, more operations would follow. The Allies had time and resources on their side. Germany had neither. Weber was assigned to a work depot at a major supply depot supporting the operation. American guards escorted 20 German prisoners each morning to help unload trucks and organize supplies. The work was not difficult, and the guards were not cruel. Weber found himself working alongside a black American sergeant named Johnson, who carried a clipboard and directed traffic with the efficiency of a train conductor. Johnson moved trucks in and out of loading zones with perfect timing. He knew exactly which supplies went to which units. He checked manifests without hesitation, his pencil marking boxes with quick, decisive strokes. Weber watched Johnson work for 3 days before speaking to him. Johnson spoke no German, and Weber's English was limited, but they managed simple conversations during breaks. Johnson explained that before the war he had worked in a warehouse in Chicago. He understood inventory and logistics. The Army had trained him for 6 weeks and then put him behind the wheel of a truck. Now he was a sergeant responsible for keeping 30 trucks moving on schedule. Johnson said this without pride or complaint. It was simply his job. On the 4th day, Weber saw something that stayed with him. A convoy of 900 trucks was being organized to support Montgomery's push. Johnson was coordinating part of this effort, checking each truck before it departed. Weber stood nearby, holding a clipboard himself now, marking crates as they were loaded. He watched the trucks roll out in perfect intervals. The mathematics was staggering. 900 trucks daily, each carrying 5 tons, meant 4,500 tons moving to support one operation. And this was just a portion of what the Red Ball Express delivered each day. Then the news arrived that Market Garden was stalling. The radios crackled with reports. The bridge at Arnhem was not captured. British paratroopers were surrounded. The corridor was too narrow. German forces were counterattacking more effectively than expected. By September 25th, it was clear the operation had failed to achieve its goals. The prisoners heard this news with mixed feelings. It was not quite a victory, but it was not quite a defeat either. The Allies had been stopped, at least temporarily. But Weber understood something the other prisoners did not. Market Garden failed because of tactical mistakes, not logistics.
Every single supply that Montgomery requested had been delivered. The trucks had arrived on time. The fuel was there. The ammunition was there. The food was there. The failure happened at the level of strategy and battlefield execution, not at the level of supply. Weber realized with cold clarity that when the Allies tried again, and they will try again, the supplies will still be there. The Red Ball Express will still be running. The abundance will still be overwhelming. November brought Thanksgiving, an American holiday Weber had never heard of before. The prisoners were informed they would receive a special meal. Weber expected perhaps slightly better soup or an extra piece of bread. What arrived was something entirely different. The guards brought in turkeys, actual roasted turkeys, with potatoes and gravy and cranberry sauce. The smell filled the barracks. Some prisoners thought it was a trick or a test. But the guards insisted, serving the food on metal trays with the same casual efficiency they did everything else. Weber sat with his tray, staring at more food than he had seen in months. A guard explained that this was a standard Thanksgiving meal. The food had been transported from Normandy in refrigerated trucks. Weber set down his fork. Refrigerated trucks. The Americans had trucks specifically designed to keep food cold, and they were using them to bring fresh meals to prisoner-of-war camps. He thought about German civilians back home who were eating turnips and black bread. He thought about soldiers at the front receiving hard biscuits and thin soup. And here he sat, a prisoner, eating turkey that had been kept cold in a special truck driven hundreds of miles for this purpose. That night, Weber wrote in a small notebook he had been permitted to keep. He wrote that he finally understood why Germany was losing. It was not because German soldiers were less brave. It was not because German weapons were inferior. It was because Germany was fighting a war of scarcity, while America was fighting a war of abundance. Every decision Germany made was about doing more with less. Every decision America made was about doing more with more. When you have enough resources that you can afford to refrigerate turkey for prisoners, you have already won. The fighting is just a formality. Weber talked with other captured officers in the days that followed. A colonel who had commanded an artillery unit said the Americans lost more trucks to accidents than German forces destroyed in combat, and they simply built more trucks to replace them. A major who had defended a river crossing said the Americans responded to one destroyed bridge by building 3 temporary bridges in 2 days. Every story revealed the same pattern. The Americans did not solve problems through clever efficiency. They solved problems by overwhelming them with resources.
Weber wrote one final entry in his notebook before the year ended. He wrote that German military academies had taught him that logistics was about managing scarcity with precision. Now he understood that American logistics was about creating abundance so vast that precision became unnecessary. If you have 10 times what you need, it does not matter if half is wasted. You still have 5 times what you need. Germany had built an entire military philosophy around the idea of limited resources. America had built a military philosophy around the idea that resources could simply be manufactured until the problem disappeared. He wrote that this was not just a different strategy, it was a different understanding of what was possible in the world. The train crossed into Germany on a cold morning in April 1946. Weber pressed his face against the window, eager for his first glimpse of home in nearly 2 years. Other former prisoners crowded around the windows too, their breath fogging the glass. They had talked about this moment for months, imagining their return, describing the streets they would walk and the families they would embrace. Now the moment was here, and the train car fell silent. The Germany outside the window was not the Germany they remembered. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls collapsed, their windows empty. Railroad stations were damaged by shells. Bridges had been rebuilt with temporary wooden structures.
People walked through the ruins wearing coats that were mostly patches. Children played in bomb craters filled with rainwater. Weber watched a woman pulling a cart loaded with belongings, her face hollow with exhaustion. This was not the proud nation he had left. This was something else entirely. The train stopped at a processing center where British occupation forces checked papers and assigned travel permits. Weber waited in line for 6 hours. He had carried very little from America. A few technical manuals about supply systems that he had been allowed to keep, a notebook filled with his observations, sketches he had made of Red Ball Express operations, and, wrapped carefully in cloth, 2 Hershey chocolate bars he had saved from his final week as a prisoner. He had not eaten them because he wanted to bring them home to his children. If his children were still alive. If his wife was still alive. He had received only 3 letters in 2 years, the last one 8 months ago. Hamburg appeared through the train window late in the afternoon. Weber had grown up in this city. He knew every street and canal. But the Hamburg he saw now looked like a city from a nightmare. The bombing had been worse here than almost anywhere else. Whole neighborhoods were gone, replaced by acres of rubble. The train station itself was partially destroyed. Its grand iron roof collapsed in sections. Weber stepped onto the platform, carrying his small bag, and stood for a long moment trying to understand where he was. Nothing looked familiar. Even the air smelled different, full of dust and smoke that never quite cleared. He walked toward his old neighborhood, following streets that existed more in memory than in reality. Some roads had been cleared enough for foot traffic. Others required climbing over piles of brick and twisted metal. He passed families living in basements of destroyed buildings, their possessions spread on blankets, cooking over small fires. He passed children who stared at them with eyes that had seen too much. He passed old men sitting on chunks of concrete, too tired or too broken to move. This was a victory for the Allies. This was a defeat for Germany. The contrast between this and the American supply depots he had witnessed was so vast that his mind struggled to hold both realities at once. His building was still standing, or at least partially standing. The top 2 floors were gone, but the lower floors remained. Weber climbed the stairs, his heart pounding. The door to his apartment was unlocked because the lock had been blown off. He pushed it open and called out. A woman's voice answered, thin and uncertain. Then his wife appeared, and for a moment neither of them moved. She looked 20 years older. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. Her hair was gray, but she was alive. She was alive, and she ran to him, and they held each other while both of them cried. His children came then, 2 daughters who had been small when he left and were now nearly teenagers. They were shy at first, not quite sure if they remembered this man. Weber reached into his bag and pulled out the chocolate bars. He unwrapped one and broke it into pieces. His daughters had never tasted American chocolate. They had never tasted any chocolate, not that they could remember. They ate slowly, their eyes wide, trying to make it last. His wife refused her piece at first, insisting the children should have it. Weber made her take it. He told her there was more where this came from. In America, chocolate was so common that soldiers threw bars to children in the street. That evening, after the children were asleep on mattresses on the floor, Weber and his wife talked. She described the years he had been gone, the bombing raids that came night after night, the fires that consumed whole districts, the food shortages that grew worse each month, the occupation forces that arrived with their tanks and their rules. She had survived by working in a British supply warehouse, sorting goods for 12 hours a day in exchange for extra rations. She asked him what it had been like in America. He did not know how to answer. He tried to explain what he had seen. He told her about the trucks, thousands of them, running day and night. He told her about the food, abundant beyond imagining. He told her about the Coca-Cola and the refrigerated trucks and the Thanksgiving turkey. His wife listened with the expression of someone hearing a fairy tale. She asked if she was exaggerating. He promised he was not. If anything, he was understating it. The abundance he had witnessed was beyond what words could properly describe. She sat quietly for a while, and then she said something he would never forget. She said that perhaps they had been lied to about everything. Perhaps the propaganda had been backwards. Perhaps America was not weak and decadent. Perhaps Germany was the one that had been weak all along. Weber found work within a month. The British occupation forces needed people who understood logistics and spoke English. They hired him to help organize reconstruction supply chains. It was strange work, helping to rebuild the country that had been his enemy, using methods he had learned by watching his enemy operate. But he did the work well. He applied principles he had observed from the Red Ball Express: standardization, redundancy, overwhelming supply. When other German workers questioned his methods, asking why they needed so many backup trucks or so many spare parts, he told them that this was how you won wars and rebuilt nations. You did not try to be clever with limited resources. You created enough resources that limits became irrelevant.
His core workers sometimes asked about his time as a prisoner. They wanted to know if he had been treated badly. He told them the truth. He had been treated better as a prisoner in America than many German civilians were treated in Germany. This statement made people uncomfortable. Some thought he was being disloyal. Others thought he was joking. But he meant every word. He had seen both sides now. He understood what victory looked like and what defeat looked like. Victory looked like trucks full of Coca-Cola. Defeat looked like children who had never tasted chocolate. Years passed. Hamburg slowly rebuilt itself. Germany became two nations, divided between East and West. Weber continued working in logistics, eventually starting his own small trucking company. He never forgot the lessons he had learned. His company operated on principles of abundance rather than scarcity. He maintained extra trucks even when they were not immediately needed. He stockpiled spare parts. He trained more drivers than necessary. Other companies laughed at his waste. But his company never failed to make a delivery, and slowly the other companies stopped laughing. In 1970, a young journalist interviewed Weber for an article about the war. The journalist asked what Weber remembered most clearly from his time as a prisoner. Weber thought for a long moment. He said he remembered the sound of the Red Ball Express, the endless rumble of trucks that never stopped. He remembered watching a black sergeant organize a convoy with stopwatch precision, while German generals had been taught that such men were inferior. He remembered eating turkey that had been transported in refrigerated trucks, while his own country could barely feed its soldiers. But most of all, he remembered the moment he understood that Germany had lost the war before it began, because Germany had been fighting with a philosophy of scarcity against a nation that operated from abundance. The journalist asked if Weber thought the Red Ball Express had been the key to Allied victory. Weber said it was more complicated than that. The Red Ball Express was a symptom of something larger. It was a demonstration of American industrial and organizational power. The same factories that could produce 6,000 identical trucks could produce 10 times that many. The same system that could deliver 12,000 tons of supplies daily by truck could expand to deliver 20,000 tons if needed. Germany had prepared for a war of limited resources managed with precision. America had prepared for a war of unlimited resources deployed with overwhelming force. No amount of German tactical skill could overcome that fundamental difference. Weber died in 1982, long after the war had become history. In his final years, he would sometimes drive on the German Autobahn system, watching modern trucks carry goods across an integrated Europe. The trucks were bigger now, more efficient, but the principle was the same. Abundant supply, constantly moving, overwhelming problems with resources. He would remember those nights in France, watching the Red Ball Express roll past his prison truck, and he would think about how the entire post-war world had been built on the lessons that convoy taught. Abundance defeats scarcity.
Industrial might matter more than tactical brilliance. And sometimes the side that seems wasteful and inefficient is actually demonstrating a form of power that traditional military thinking cannot comprehend. The Red Ball Express operated for only 81 days, but in changing warfare forever and in changing everything that came after. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.